Right now, at this very moment, a small bug helped scientists figure out when humans first put on clothes. Not a cave painting, not a fossil coat, a louse. Stick with me because this one gets weird fast, and it starts with something you'd never expect to matter this much. Most people assume clothing is just common sense. You get cold, you cover up, end of story. But the real history is stranger than that, and slower than that, and it involves an insect that most of us spend our lives trying to avoid. Here's the setup. Humans lost most of their body hair a very long time ago, in a slow, gradual process rather than a single sudden change. We're talking well over 1 million years back, long before anyone we'd recognize as us was walking around. The leading idea among researchers is that early humans were becoming long-distance runners and hunters, chasing prey across hot plains until the animal collapsed from exhaustion. Thick fur traps heat close to the skin. Bare skin covered in sweat glands lets that heat escape instead. Humans actually have far more sweat glands than most other mammals, which made us unusually good at cooling down while moving. Genetic research on skin pigmentation genes has been used to estimate roughly when this shift happened, and different studies put it somewhere between 1 and 2 million years ago, well before our species even existed in its current form. So the fur went, and a mostly naked, sweaty body plan became the new design for survival on those plains. That means for an enormous stretch of human history, we were walking around with no fur and no clothes, just skin, for over 1 million years. So when did we start covering up? Here's where it gets clever. Clothes are made of cloth, leather, and fur, and none of that survives for tens of thousands of years buried in dirt. It rots, it breaks down, it's gone. So how do you find solid evidence for something that no longer physically exists? You look at lice. Head lice have been riding around on human scalps forever, evolving right alongside us, tightly adapted to gripping individual strands of hair. But there's another kind of louse, the body louse, and it doesn't live on skin at all. It lives in the seams and fibers of clothing, only coming out to feed, then retreating back into the fabric to lay its eggs. A body louse cannot survive without something to hide in. No clothes, no home for this bug, no body louse, and eventually, no separate species at all. Researchers realized that if they compared the DNA of head lice and body lice, they could estimate roughly when the two split into separate species. This works because DNA mutations build up at a fairly steady, measurable rate over generations, a method scientists call a molecular clock. That split would mark, approximately, the moment humans started wearing something regularly enough for a whole new insect lifestyle to evolve around it. The first major genetic study on this, published in the early 2000s, put the split at somewhere around 170,000 years ago. A later study, using a different genetic method, came up with a younger estimate, somewhere between 70,000 and 120,000 years ago. Scientists still debate the exact number, and honestly, they may never land on a single precise year. But both estimates point to the same rough window: modern humans figuring out clothing tens of thousands of years before anything we'd call recorded history begins. That's a strange thought to sit with. The invention of clothing might be one of the better documented events in deep prehistory, and we didn't learn about it from a preserved garment. We learned about it from a parasite's family tree. Now let's talk about what those first clothes probably looked like, because they were nothing like a jacket. Early clothing wasn't sewn together, it was draped. Think animal hide, pulled off a carcass, scraped clean of fat and tissue, then wrapped around the body. Archaeologists have found stone tools called scrapers at sites going back hundreds of thousands of years, and the wear patterns on their edges match exactly the kind of use you'd get from working animal skins, a specific type of polish and micro-damage that shows up again and again under microscopic study. Neanderthals used these tools too at sites across Europe. So did earlier human ancestors, long before modern humans existed. That tells us hideworking itself is genuinely ancient, older than the lice-based estimate for actual worn clothing, by a wide margin. But scraping a hide clean and turning it into a fitted garment are two very different skill levels. A draped hide is basically a blanket with a gap for your head, maybe tied at the waist with a strip of sinew or twisted plant fiber. It works. It keeps you warmer than bare skin, and it would have made a real difference on a cold night. But it's loose, it lets wind straight through at the edges, and it's not built for serious, sustained cold. For real cold weather survival, you need tailoring, you need seams, and for seams, you need needles. The oldest known needle with an eye hole, meaning a hole made for thread rather than just a sharpened point, was found in Denisova Cave in Siberia. It's carved from bird bone and dated to roughly 50,000 years ago, small enough to hold between 2 fingers, yet precise enough to have been drilled with real intent. Similar early-eyed needles have turned up at sites in China from a comparable general period. These aren't crude, rushed tools either. They're thin, polished, and clearly made for precise stitching. the kind you'd need to build a fitted coat, tight boots, or a hood that actually blocks wind instead of just slowing it down. This is the moment clothing stopped being a blanket and became technology, a genuine craft passed down and improved over generations. There's more physical evidence for how seriously ancient people took this. Researchers studying human toe bones from Tianyuan Cave in China, dated to roughly 40,000 years ago, noticed something odd. The smaller toes were less robust than you'd expect for a habitually barefoot walker, while the big toe stayed strong. One interpretation, proposed by anthropologist Eric Trinkhaus, is that this pattern shows up when people regularly wear supportive footwear, since a shoe reduces the gripping work the smaller toes would otherwise do on rough or uneven ground. It's not direct proof of a shoe surviving in the dirt, since no actual shoe from that era has been found. It's a footprint left inside the bones themselves, and it points toward humans wearing something on their feet by that point in history. And the timing of all this matters. Around this same general period, modern humans were pushing into some of the coldest environments our species had ever tried to live in. Siberia, Northern Europe during the depths of the Ice Age, places where a loose draped hide simply would not cut it. Winters that could sit far below freezing for months at a stretch. With wind chill making it feel even worse, and exposed skin does not last long in that kind of cold. Fitted, layered, sewn clothing wasn't a fashion choice at that point. It was the line between a group surviving a winter and not surviving it. There's an ongoing conversation among researchers about how much of an advantage this gave modern humans over Neanderthals, who lived across Ice Age Europe for a long stretch themselves, and survived plenty of cold winters on their own. Neanderthals clearly wore something, since the same style of scraper tools shows up constantly at their sites. But eyed needles and clear signs of tailored, layered clothing are mostly linked to modern humans, appearing in the record around the same time modern humans pushed deeper into cold northern regions. Some researchers argue that better cold-weather clothing gave modern humans a real edge in surviving harsh climates that Neanderthals struggled with, possibly contributing to Neanderthals eventually dying out. Others point out this is hard to prove with certainty, since preserved clothing from either group barely exists anywhere. It's a genuine, open debate, not a settled fact, so it's worth holding loosely rather than repeating as certain. There's also a burial site called Sunghir in Russia, roughly 30,000 years old, where archaeologists found bodies covered in thousands of small ivory beads, each one individually carved and drilled by hand. The beads weren't scattered randomly. Their positioning on the skeletons lines up with patterns you'd expect if they were originally sewn onto clothing that has since rotted away, tracing the outline of hats, shirts, and trousers that no longer exist but left their decoration behind in place, almost like a ghost outline of a garment. It's an indirect clue, but a striking one, showing that by this point clothing wasn't just functional. It was decorated, it took real time to make, and it mattered to how people presented themselves, even in death. What isn't debated is that once sewing shows up, clothing gets more sophisticated fast. And we have one incredible, direct example of just how sophisticated it eventually became, thousands of years later. In 1991, hikers walking in the mountains found a body preserved in ice in the Alps, nicknamed Ötzi. He lived around 5,300 years ago, and because the ice froze him almost immediately, his clothing survived alongside him in remarkable detail. He was wearing a cloak woven from grass, a coat and leggings stitched from different animal hides chosen for different purposes, a belt, a loincloth, shoes stuffed with grass for insulation, and a bearskin hat. His shoes alone show a level of thinking that would work as a decent winter boot designed today, a waterproof outer layer made from deer hide, an insulating inner layer of soft grass, and a bearskin sole, all built specifically for the cold mountain terrain he was crossing when he died. Ötzi isn't from the era clothing was invented. He's thousands of years after that, living in the Copper Age, but he's proof of where the idea eventually led. What started as grabbing a hide off a dead animal and wrapping it around yourself turned, over tens of thousands of years, into layered, purpose-built outfits, matched to specific climates, specific activities, and specific materials. So here's the part that tends to surprise people most. Losing our fur and needing clothes were not the same event. They weren't even closed together on the timeline. Fur loss happened over 1 million years ago. Clothing shows up somewhere between 70,000 and 170,000 years ago, depending on which study you trust. That leaves a gap of hundreds of thousands of years where humans were furless, mostly naked, and just dealing with it. Sun, cold nights, whatever the weather brought, handled with nothing but bare skin. Clothing wasn't an automatic next step after losing fur. It was a separate invention, arriving much later, likely driven by humans spreading into colder climates where bare skin genuinely wasn't survivable anymore. It's less, humans got cold so they invented clothes, and more humans went naked for an extraordinarily long stretch, adapting in other ways, and only invented clothes once survival genuinely demanded it, not a moment before. And once they did invent it, it left a trace we're still reading today, not in the fabric itself, which is long gone, but in a tiny blood-sucking insect that evolved a completely new way of living, because humans gave it somewhere new to live, somewhere warm, somewhere hidden, somewhere that simply did not exist before people started wrapping themselves in hide and fur. Next time something makes you itch, remember that same basic relationship between humans and a small parasite is part of how we know our ancestors figured out how to get dressed, one scraped hide, one bone needle, and one stitched seam at a time.